We have Bianca Gibson. Bianca Gibson is a developer at realestate.com.au in Melbourne who became a functional programming enthusiast after getting a taste building functional web apps in Scala. She was previously a council member of Linux Australia. So please welcome Bianca and her talk, Imposter Syndrome.
Hi, so I'll be talking to you about imposter syndrome, which is when... Sorry, my slides should be progressing. Okay. Which is the experience of fraudulent thoughts and feelings and an inability to attribute and internalise your personal achievements. So in other words, it's when you go, oh no, everybody's going to realise I have absolutely no idea what I'm doing. Which is extremely common. So we're going to start with some questions to help determine if we have it. Going to talk a bit about how it works, some of the consequences of it, and some techniques for dealing with it. So we're going to start with a bunch of questions that are based on a quiz that was developed by Pauline Rose Clance, who initially discovered it. This is a cut-down version, so it's not really a proper diagnosis. I've simplified it a bit, but if you put your hand up to say that most of these are true for you, then you probably have it. So, have you often succeeded on a test or task, even though you were afraid you would not do well before you undertook the task? I can give the impression that I'm more competent than I really am. I avoid evaluations if possible and have a dread of others evaluating me. When people praise me for something I've accomplished, I'm afraid I won't be able to live up to their expectations of me in the future. Sometimes I think I obtained my present position or gained my present success because I happened to be in the right place at the right time, knew the right people, or knew the right people. Some people are even putting 2 hands up. I think that's to strongly agree. I'm afraid people important to me may find out that I'm not as capable as they think I am. I tend to remember the incidents in which I have not done my best more than those times I have done my best. I rarely do a project or task as well as I'd like to do it. Sometimes I feel or believe that my success in my life or in my job has been the result of some kind of error. It's hard for me to accept compliments or praise about my intelligence or accomplishments. Some more 2 hands. At times, I feel my success has been due to some kind of luck. I'm disappointed at times in my present accomplishments and think I should have accomplished much more. Sometimes I'm afraid others will discover how much knowledge or ability I really lack. I think that might be almost everybody. I saw one person that didn't have their hand up. I'm often afraid I may fail at a new assignment or undertaking, even though I generally do well at what I attempt. When I've succeeded at something and received recognition for my accomplishments, I have doubts that I can keep repeating that success. If I receive a great deal of praise or recognition for something I've accomplished, I tend to discount the importance of what I've done. I often compare my ability to those around me and think they may be more intelligent than I am. I often worry about not succeeding with a project or examination, even though others around me have considerable confidence that I'll do well. If I'm going to receive a promotion or gain recognition of some kind, I hesitate to tell others until it's an accomplished fact. I feel bad and discouraged if I'm not the best or at least very special in situations that involve achievement. So most of us were putting our hands up for most things. In a one of the practice runs, my arm actually got sore because I was putting my hand up so much. So I had to alternate. But this was initially discovered in high-achieving women in academia and students, but it's since been found in other populations as well. It could be higher in women, but there's actually research going both ways, and I'm not sure which would be correct. And it could be higher in some ethnic groups. It's really, the studies that look at that have really only looked at African Americans, so it doesn't give you much to go off at this stage. It tends to be more common in minorities in their field, so in technology, it could be women or other minorities. And this is the wrong, sorry, I've pulled up the wrong version of the slides. Can I? It should be okay. So it's common when we're going into a new endeavour. So I thought I'd beaten it in a tech context, but then I went into some new contexts. I ended up volunteering with the Greens, and I went into a coordinator and organiser role quite quickly. I coordinated the third ever door knock I attended. And I remember saying, I've done some door knocking before. 2 is some, right? And some of the people I was training had done more door knocking than me. So that was an interesting experience. And at our volunteer party, one of our amazing Melbourne City Council candidates went, oh, you should run for Yarra Council. And it all came flooding back. But what are some of the characteristics of it? So when we're experiencing, can you read that up the back? I'm not sure if it will be legible. Cool. So when we get achievement-related tasks up in this corner, we tend to respond by feeling anxiety, self-doubt, and worry. And to cope with this, there are 2 main paths. So the one I'll tend to take is the over-preparation path, where we put in so much work and make this trying to fulfill this task so perfectly. And then we succeed, we get the accomplishment, we feel a brief sense of relief and get positive feedback. But then we discount the positive feedback because we reason that the only reason we went well is because we put in more work than everybody else, and won't accept that maybe our abilities had something to do with it. Or we could deal with it through procrastination. This is the approach. Yep. So this is the uni student, the stereotypical uni student that puts their assignment up to the last day and then stays up till 5 in the morning. So they put in a heroic effort at the end, and then they still succeed, they get accomplishment, they feel a brief sense of relief, and they get positive feedback on it, and then they reason that they must have just gotten lucky, anything other than attributing it to themselves. So we discount the positive feedback, so the success gives us no satisfaction and does not help us feel any better, which leads to perceived fraudulence, higher self-doubt, and higher risk of depression and anxiety. And next time we get an achievement-related task, we just go right back around, and the success never helps us feel better. So, as we just saw, when people have imposter syndrome, we tend to attribute successes to outside factors and failures to internal factors. So if we succeed, we could go, we put in a lot of work, we got lucky, our colleagues really pulled it through, and then when we fail, we tend to attribute it to things about ourselves we can't change. So we might go, if we fail, that must be because we're stupid, rather than accepting any external factors could play into that. And this pattern is more common in women. And it could be worse for women because viewing ourselves as phony could be consistent with a societal view that we tend to be less competent, and it's easier to go along with that than to reject that view. And it can be worse for African American women and probably other groups that suffer from similar stereotypes. And we also have a tendency to believe that intelligence is fixed rather than malleable, and that we can't really change it through our work. And when we fail, we tend to react quite helplessly. So we can blame ourselves, withdraw from the task, experience feelings of anxiety and shame. We also tend to be overly concerned with other people's opinions of us and try and project a really heavily idealised, perfect self-image, which is completely unrealistic. And our self-worth also tends to be unusually dependent on others. We rely on the external validation, so then if that goes away, we can be quite fragile. It's not a good state to be in. I've got a sore throat. I recovered enough to talk. And success doesn't fix it because we're just going to attribute all our successes to something else, to luck, to our colleagues, anyone but ourselves. And then when we don't meet our perfectionist standards, we'll tend to focus on the gap between our actual performance and our unrealistic expectations of ourselves and not accept the success that we did achieve because it's not quite perfect. And we tend to experience a desire to be the best. A lot of people find that they'll be very high achieving in school. They'll be the big fish in the small pond, and then they move on to some form of higher education like university, and there are a lot more people, there are a lot more smart people. Suddenly they're not the best anymore, so then they conclude, oh, I'm not the best, so I must be stupid, because they can't accept there is a middle ground between the best and stupid. There also tends to be some fear and guilt about success, a mistrust of others, low enjoyable involvement with other people in women, low play, not doing things for fun in everybody, low impulsivity in women and higher in men, lower need for change in women and higher in men, and low need for order in men. And there are some childhood circumstances that can play into it. There are two main cases. One of them is where it's more likely to happen to girls, where a sibling or a close relative is a designated smart one that's going to achieve so much, but they're, say, the designated people person. They have good social skills, or they're not encouraged to pursue achievement, but they're still raised in an environment that values that achievement. And then they're not really encouraged to achieve, so they have trouble internalising their accomplishments. Or on the other hand, they can be told, you are so perfect, you are so superior, success should come easily with no work, and you have to be so successful. And then when they realise that you do actually have to work for success, it doesn't just magically happen, they have trouble accepting that because they've been told that it should come easily and they've been taught to value it without effort. And it's also, and they can end up feeling that nothing they can, and there's also links to how feedback is provided to children. So if they're provided excessive positive feedback, say every single thing they do is so good, then they learn that the feedback doesn't really relate to the actual outcome, so they just learn to discount it if they're told that everything is awesome even if it's not. But if they're not given any positive feedback, then they can feel that their accomplishments are devalued and they don't end up considering it worthwhile themselves, and they can end up feeling that nothing they ever do will be good enough. And it also tends to be higher when family cohesion and expressiveness are low, so they're not really getting along too well, talking about their feelings that much. And and family conflict and control tend to increase it. And people with imposter syndrome also tend to try to portray a heavily idealised image to their family members to try and win that approval. And it's also hiring people with neuroticism and achievement orientation, and there are different sources that seem credible that go each way about whether higher or lower conscientiousness plays into it. Maybe it depends on the circumstance, because the studies are in different situations. And there are also some work circumstances that can play into it. Unfortunately, it hasn't been studied in a tech context, but we can try and extrapolate from what we can learn from the studies in academia and the library world. So from the studies in academia, they've concluded that highly competitive and stressful occupations can increase it. I'm not sure if the peer review aspects in academia increase it, because that's also present for developers, so it would be relevant to us. And it's quite a bit higher in untenured faculty, so people that aren't permanent staff. So if people can be made permanent, it might help them feel better. And when looked at in a library context, it's higher in systems librarians. They're the more technical librarians. So they have to deal with constant technical change, needing to pick up new skills, and they can easily feel outdated, which I think maps quite well to developers being expected to just keep picking up all of these emerging technologies. And it's really easy to focus on the ones you're not familiar with, but other people are, to get an unfair impression on how well you're keeping up with it. And there isn't as much research into racial issues with imposter syndrome as would be ideal. It's really only been looked at in African Americans. But it's found to be worse for African American women, the theory being that there's a lot of people presume they're incompetent more so than other women. So it's really important for them to internalise their self-worth and be very self-reliant, because other people's assessments of them are going to be quite unfair. And a technique that was particularly effective for them was group counselling sessions with other African American women. So it was people that they had something in common with. It was easier for them to talk to each other. They had more similar experiences, and they could see the ridiculousness of each other's feelings and provide that perspective to each other and share strategies that would work. And there are theories that this could be more of a self-presentation strategy than not internalising your achievements. It seems to be mostly considered to be not internalising your achievements, but it's a theory. So we don't want to appear imperfect, but then we actually openly disclose that we're imperfect through things like rejecting positive feedback. And it could be to avoid the negative interpersonal consequences of failure, of letting people down in the future, as a form of expectation management. And we tend to only express lower performance evaluations of ourselves when we know other people are going to see it. If participants are told that it's anonymous, they don't actually express the lower expectations. And I think this would make a lot of sense for women in particular environments, since being seen as competent can make you less likable. So I think it would make good sense to do self-presentation technique. And there are some behaviours that we engage in that can keep it going. So sometimes we can engage in intellectual inauthenticity, so we're not genuine about what we say we think. So we can tell people what they want to hear and try and pander to their biases. Or we could implement something how the senior developer or the tech lead would want us to, not how we actually think would be optimal. And we may also choose to stay silent in the face of opposing viewpoints, which prevents us from finding out what people would actually think of our viewpoints, so it can keep it going. You're not going to get positive feedback on your contributions to discussions if you don't make the contributions. So it's hard to break out of that. We can also try and pick a target that we want to get accepted by. We want them to praise us intellectually. But we also aim to be liked. So we find out what would please them. We might pick up some people will pick up some of their hobbies, engages in intellectual inauthenticity and lots of flattery, and then generally gets the praise that we're after. But then we can just dismiss it because we just charm them. It's only because they like us. So then they can go and pick a new target and just keep trying to get this validation, but every time perceiving it is invalid because of the use of charm. And sometimes questioning why they feel they need this outside approval if they're meant to be so capable. We can also avoid displays of confidence for fear of rejection. So this has been found more in the studies on women. So there's a bit of a motivation to avoid success due to pretty well justified fear of rejection or being seen as less feminine. And denying your success allows you to act out your achievement orientation, but not reject that expectation so much. So that would work as an impression management technique. And what are some of the consequences of this? 'Cause what problems does it really cause us? We can end up with general poor mental health, bouts of depression and anxiety, emotional exhaustion and burnout, general psychological distress, lower self-confidence, lower job well-being, satisfaction and performance, And lower self-efficacy, which is really hard to break out of because our current self-efficacy provides an anchor for all future evaluations. So if we have it low, then we're evaluating something that we do, it's going to tend to go down. If we have higher self-efficacy, it's going to tend to go up. So once it's established, it's really hard to get out of. But there are some ways to cope with it. Mentoring is really helpful. So they can help normalize the feelings through discussing it and expressing that they feel it as well, which they probably do. They can provide some emotional support and they can provide some tactile help with specific problems. You could go to them for perspective. Say if you're thinking of declining an opportunity because you don't feel qualified or not applying for something because you don't feel qualified, they can provide you with some perspective and can be more able to judge it than you yourself are. And they can also challenge people to accept praise that they've received, and they're helpful even if you don't explicitly discuss imposter syndrome. But on the other hand, they can be a target of unfair comparisons. Comparing yourself to your mentor tends to not go very well. Positive reinforcement can be really helpful. A strategy that I really liked was from the Federal Greens campaign I worked on. You don't need to read the notes. That's not the point. It looks like you're reading them. I should have made it smaller. So at the end of the campaign, all the core team volunteers had this envelope where people could put their notes of appreciation. So I found that really helpful to help me internalize it because a lot of people were saying much the same thing. So I could go, oh, this person and this person and this person all value that contribution I made. And it covered everything I did from coordinating door knocks to my vital contributions to the Friday lunchtime quiz. And I can also go and look back on that when I want to. And if we identify the feelings, that's really the first step to dealing with it and helping others to identify it. I remember at one point I had such bad imposter syndrome that I thought, oh yeah, those people have imposter syndrome, but I'm right to feel like an imposter. They've got imposter syndrome, I'm right. And someone had to tell me how silly that was for me to actually realise what was going on. I actually felt like someone more qualified than me should talk about imposter syndrome. And just giving yourself a reality check and thinking through and questioning the thoughts that you're having and doing the same to other people, challenging those patterns. And differentiate between what you're feeling and the reality, reasoning and consciously thinking about your achievements rather than accepting, I don't feel that I've achieved much. That's just because you're not internalizing it. Some people like to use humour or just distracting themselves when the thoughts come up. Social support can be really helpful. You can discuss the feelings and you can get perspective from other people, which can help you see that what you're internalizing doesn't quite match up with the reality. Reducing your dependency on external validation is really important. Part of the pattern is an over-reliance on external validation, and it's generally a good idea to have less dependency on it because when it goes away, you can have problems. Some people like to list and own their accomplishments. So someone I spoke to had this Trello board that she put it on. Some people might journal it, maybe update your resume, something to list it and own it and help you accept and internalize it. But what can you do just after this talk? So the top actions I'd suggest are talking about it. So to other people after this session, maybe at the dinner, when you get back to work, you could get a bunch of people together to discuss it, and that can help people realise, oh, everybody else feels this way, and you can share some coping strategies to help each other deal with it. And if you're all just more aware of it, awareness is the first step to dealing with it. Be aware when other people are showing it, and also when you're showing it, so you can fight back to those feelings. Challenge people to accept the positive feedback that you're giving them. So if they're not accepting it, ask them why. Maybe they're attributing it, if they're attributing to external factors like luck, maybe they continue to succeed at much the same task very well over and over again, and every single time they say it's luck. Maybe ask them if they just keep getting lucky or if they're actually good at it. And try and point, when you're providing the feedback, try and point to something, a particular characteristic that helps them do that. So it's harder for us to attribute it to luck, to the other people on the team, or something like that. Getting perspective from other people. It was really important for me to be told how silly it was to think everyone else had imposter syndrome, and I was right. And they can help provide perspective on specific things you've done and provide more feedback. But it's important you go to people that will judge you fairly for this, because if it's someone that'll be unfairly harsh, it's just going to get a whole lot worse for you. And I have raced through that. Do we have questions?
Yep, questions? Just right here.
Hi, I really loved your speech. That was fantastic. So a lot of your keystone articles were maybe up to 30 years old, and that's absolutely fine. So your resolution of your articles that you were talking about, resolution of imposter syndrome, were only 5 to 10 years old. So the first question is, why do you think there's that divide and it's taken that long to start addressing it?
I'm not sure. I think maybe we're not talking about it as much as we should have. And when I see it discussed in tech, it tends to not draw on the research at all. So I think there's a disconnect between people that are trying to deal with it and the research behind it, which I was aiming to address.
Cool. So my second question is, why do you think the research predominantly focuses on females?
It was initially discovered in women. So the people who discovered it were counselling female students in academics, and that's where they found it. So I think that's why it's ended up focusing on women. And I think it was at first assumed to be mainly in women, but there's now conflicting evidence about that.
Hi, thanks. Great speech. I was just wondering, if you use feelings of this, and this might be a better question for a psychiatrist, but if you use feelings of inadequacy as a means of motivating yourself towards self-improvement, when you feel like, when you no longer have that that feeling of being an imposter, what do you replace that with to not sort of just sit down and go, yep, I'm great?
Yeah, so some people say that it helps motivate them, but I'm not sure. I don't think there's evidence for it actually increasing performance. There's evidence for the opposite. And that doesn't sound like a healthy way of motivating yourself. So maybe you could have particular achievements that you're striving for rather than trying to prove that you're capable, which is generally what people with imposter syndrome are trying to do. Have a particular thing you're trying to achieve, and that's probably a healthier way to go about it.
Hi, thanks for the interesting presentation. All the groups you talk about are like classic groups that are, targeted in oppression. When you talk about women and the patriarchy and, African American women in particular and colonialism and all that stuff. Do you think as those structures are dismantled that imposter syndrome will become less prevalent?
I hope so, but it's also found in other populations. So I think those oppressions can exacerbate it, but it exists outside of that. It's also found in non-oppressed groups. So it wouldn't go away, but hopefully it would reduce, particularly, say, for African American women, that a lot of people presuming they're incompetent seem to make it far, far harder for them because they've been told by society around them since they were very young that they're incompetent. It's harder for them to accept that they are competent.
My name is Imad, and I have two questions. So do you think it is all of this arises from low self-esteem? And number two, are there people who have high self-esteem and still suffer with imposter syndrome?
It's related to low self-esteem, but I don't understand the link that well. I'm not actually a psychologist. So it can definitely it's definitely related to low self-esteem, but I don't know what causal relationships are there.
Any more questions?
Hi, thank you for the interesting presentation. I'm just wondering, one thing I found myself thinking during this talk was, because it's so been commonly prevalent found in women and minority groups, as a white male who is the complete opposite of that, I found myself thinking, I'm not one of these groups, therefore this must not be imposter syndrome. Is that imposter syndrome?
That sounds a bit like me going, they have imposter syndrome, but I'm right, to be honest. It's been found in other populations. It may have been initially found in women, but it has been found in other populations. So it's prevalent, at least in libraries and academia, among everybody.
Great. Anyone else? Nope. Yeah.
And a related question, does imposter syndrome inhibit learning? Because the reason I'm asking this is that one of the slides you put up quite early is it had to do with going outside of your field of expertise and going to something new. And I experienced that when I went from being completely uncoordinated to taking on swing dancing. Because like all of the other stuff that I'd done in my life, I was like way good at. Except maybe learning languages, because it's the same sort of deal. It's like when I go into a field where I feel like I'm just ordinary, I feel I shouldn't be doing this, I'm just ordinary. Does it inhibit learning is the question.
I think it has been shown to inhibit at least job performance. How much would inhibit learning probably depends. It would depend on the circumstance. Like the people that are using the procrastination pattern, it probably inhibits their learning a fair bit. Probably a bit, but I'm not sure.
Okay, so when you combine the imposter syndrome with like the Dunning-Kruger effect of being really unable to measure your own competence, how do you know if... So you get through it and you're like, okay, so I have imposter syndrome, maybe I'm good at stuff. How do you prove it to yourself? How do you take that step?
If possible, if you can find objective measures. So students could use their marks. That's more objective. If you're not fortunate enough to have something that objective to lean on, feedback from people that will judge you fairly. It's very important that you pick people that will judge you fairly, and trying to get people to speak up when they have positive feedback. And maybe if you could ask some of your colleagues for perspective on how you're feeling about it. I found that they tend to have positive things they haven't actually said. And then if I prompt them on it, they have all these positive things to say that they never would have brought up otherwise. And getting that external perspective is really helpful for me.
Okay. Anyone else? Oh, yeah.
Thank you.
No worries. I'm curious whether or not in researching for this you've come across any either causal or just correlated links between this style of education. For instance, going through public school in New Zealand, there was this huge driver towards either be good at a sport or you're a goody two-shoes. So from very, very early, I felt a lot of social pressure towards proving myself externally. So how much correlation do you think there is?
I think that putting people into those boxes would have a similar effect to some of the more parental childhood circumstances we talked about, where people can be meant to achieve things and meant to achieve it easily, or can be not meant to achieve academically. I think it'd function the same way.
Do you think, thanks for the talk and everything, do you think there is anything as a community we could do to help people in this situation?
Talking about it, that's why I'm here. And then when you feel something positive, when you think something positive about, say, what someone's done, telling them, so they can get that feedback and get that perspective to help them internalise their accomplishments, and trying to structure your feedback to help them accept that it's due to them, it's not just due to luck, and trying to challenge them to accept that feedback, but discussing it can really help normalising it and is hugely helpful.
Yep, no, at the back.
In answer to the last question, there are several online resources, the most prominent of which was put out by the ADA initiative, and it's a imposter syndrome workshop. And I know there are people here in Australia who are qualified to run it. I run it sometimes in the US. If you're interested in that, you can probably contact someone and get them to come to a conference like this and do the workshop. It's usually only a couple hours, and it's really valuable.
Any more? Nope, I guess that's it then. Okay, to finish off, Bianca, I'd like to present you a small gift on behalf of PyCon 2016. Everyone, one more round of applause for Bianca.